Hi everyone, and welcome to Nuclear Energy's Insiders webinar with Entergy and the Nuclear Energy Institute, titled Used Fuel Strategy, Utility and Industry Perspectives for the Short and Long Term. My name is Kevin Anderson. You've probably seen some of my emails before, and I'm the organizer for this webinar, and I'm actually responsible for the 6th Nuclear Decommissioning and Used Fuel Strategy Summit 2019 on the 30th of September and the 1st of October in Charlotte, North Carolina. Obviously, this webinar is one of a number of pieces of work we're doing to promote the industry and some of the key issues within it. We will also have multiple white papers upcoming, which will be available through our website, and all of our past white papers are on there as well. And we will have another webinar upcoming later in the year as well, so do watch out for that. So there are almost just over 250 of you signed up today, actually, which is brilliant. So thank you very much for the great response, and thank you in advance to both of our panelists for their time and making the time to be here today. So just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. The webinar will be about 45 minutes of presentations, followed with about 15 minutes of Q&A afterwards. The whole session is being recorded, so if you need to dip out at any point or you wanted to send it to somebody else after the fact, we will send the full audio recordings and presentations to you. We will send them sometime next week. You do have the facility to ask questions as well. As you've seen, I've asked the question, can the audience hear the audio? Feel free to ask questions in the questions tab. The more questions, the better. If we don't manage to get to your question at the end, we will submit those questions to the presenters so we can email out their answers afterwards. The purpose of today's session is really to take a closer look at the current and future state of used fuel strategy and what this means for the utility and for the wider industry alike. So introducing the presenters we have on today. Joining me are Rod McCullum, who is the Senior Director for Decommissioning and Used Fuel Programs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. So thank you very much, Rod, for being here today. We also have Sam Morris, who is the Senior Counsel for Used Fuel at Entergy. So thank you very much, Sam, as well, for being here today. With both of these speakers speaking at the conference, the Nuclear Decommissioning and Used Fuel Strategy Summit in Charlotte. If you want to hear more from both of them, especially as we have 3 more speakers coming from Entergy, do make sure that you check us out. Our website is nuclearenergyinsider.com. You'll easily be able to find our events tab and find the Nuclear Decommissioning and Used Fuel Strategy Summit event from there. Like I said, please do make sure that you use the questions tab. The questions tab is really important, and it really helps to foster as much discussion as possible. So make sure you are asking those questions. So that's it from me. As much as I'd like to think so, I'm pretty sure people did not sign up to the webinar just hear from me. So Rod, without further ado, I will allow you to share your screen and take it from there. And as we mentioned, Rod, make sure to take yourself off of mute, just so we can.
I am off mute, Kevin, and thank you. I don't know. You may be incorrect about that. Maybe people did. Dial in to hear you. You have a very pleasant British accent, which we don't hear every day over here in the United States. So I do appreciate that. Is my screen now? You're welcome. Is my screen now visible?
I can see your screen. Yes.
Okay. So this is where we're trying to go here. You should all be looking at a very pleasing and view of a mountain lake, very clean environmental vision for the future. That's what we're trying to do with nuclear energy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in the used fuel area to help pave the way for a future that looks like this. You notice I have titled my talk Moving Forward. I am not going to try to tell folks here today that there's been some sort of earth-shattering new progress or that we have more momentum than we've ever had or anything like that. Certainly for me to do so in the wake of earlier this week's vote on in the House Appropriations Committee, where the House failed to authorize any money for Yucca Mountain for reasons that were purely political. We're not seeing moving forward out of Congress. And I know Sam is going to talk a lot more about that. So, yeah, I will just say that NEI believes very strongly we need both Yucca Mountain and interim storage to work together. and then I'll let Sam talk about the details of where that stands. I'm saying moving forward in the context of the conversation is shifting. Maybe moving forward is in a much different direction. I have been doing this for 20 years, and I have not seen the conversation shift as dramatically as it is right now. We just recently held NEI's Used Fuel Management Conference down in West Palm Beach, Florida. There were three major takeaways from that. The first one goes to that shift I was talking about, and that was that the private sector rocks. We heard a lot about private consolidated interim storage. We heard a lot about what is being done out at utility sites, and the country, the American free enterprise, is doing a lot on moving used fuel forward, despite the continued inaction of our government. I'll also talk about some of the things the private sector has established to facilitate longer-term storage, as well as the sharper point we're now putting on transformative regulatory change that's needed here in this country. So those are the three big takeaways from that conference. Maybe some of you in this audience were there and were part of bringing those themes to light. I thank you. Those are really where I tend to stand, because in the wake of yet another failure of Congress to help us, while we continue to help ourselves quite smartly. And now I'm trying to move my slides forward, and I am having difficulty. Oh, there, they moved too far. Okay, I will use that. As I mentioned, we're trying to get to this clean energy future, which is represented by the light bulb, but you'll see in the light bulb we have competition, and wind and solar. We tend to cry in our beer when an existing nuclear plant shuts down, and we're doing a lot to try to preserve the existing fleet. You see in the upper left, those are the four things NEI does: preserve, sustain, innovate, and thrive. We've been having a lot of success in preserve in states like New Jersey and New York, and Connecticut, Illinois. Not so much in Pennsylvania right now. Ohio is very much in play, but it's not about simply preserving the existing fleet. It's about advanced nuclear. It's the next fleet. The wind and solar installations that are going up today, and certainly the natural gas plants that are going up today, are very different from those even 5 years ago, much less 10, 15 years ago. We too need to advance our technology. We need to have a competitive energy form here that can compete with others that are technologically advancing. So it's really about preserving the existing fleet until we can bring an advanced fleet to bear to compete in the clean energy marketplace. And I really think the clean energy marketplace is eventually going to be the only energy marketplace going forward in the long term. So what I'll be talking about is in the sustain. To make ourselves competitive, we need to reduce the unnecessary cost and burden out of this industry. And while Sam's going to talk about how we recover the cost of used fuel from the government, it's certainly a burden. It does reputational damage to our industry. I've talked in the Innovate column here. I've talked to a lot of advanced reactor developers, and they'll tell me flat out that investment capital is constrained by concerns over used fuel. And so if we can unleash those constraints, we can put in place the final piece of our value chain puzzle you see at the bottom of the screen here, and we can have an efficient and competitive energy form where we can innovate, and then we compete globally. If you notice the reactors being sold around the world, they tend to be Korean or Russian or Chinese. So we need to reestablish our global competitive position, because clean energy existing only in the United States doesn't do us a lot of good. And again, used fuel is vitally important, and despite the continued congressional inaction, we are doing a lot in the private sector. We already have done a lot. As you can see from the next slide, I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it because it really does bear repeating, so I apologize to those who've heard me say it. Dry cask storage, once our pool is filled up, dry cask storage has gone from an unintended solution to an unexpected problem to one of the greatest industrial success stories of our time. We've successfully loaded 3,000 casks. You see this number here is the end of 2018. I can assure you we've now loaded over 3,000 dry cast storage systems at 72 sites. It's been a very strong record. It's been a record of success. It's been a record that has been driven by free enterprise. Holtec, NEC International, and TN Americas, or Arano, as it is now known, are three very competitive companies. And their ability to innovate and develop these systems has gotten us to a place where Sam will talk about the issue is a lot about recovering the cost from the government as opposed to being stopped by used fuel. And we've now renewed licenses at 30 of these sites for 60-year periods. NRC and the continued storage rulemaking found that you could store for at least 100 years before you'd have to think about repackaging. That doesn't mean it's only good for 100 years. That means it's good for at least 100 years. And how we've gotten to there is quite remarkable. And that is one of the things that I think is the big takeaways here. It was from our conference, and it should be from this webinar, is that we have put in place the tools to meet our long-term commitment to managing these independent spent fuel storage installations. This was recently dramatically demonstrated out at San Onofre. There were a couple events there. A canister was hung up during loading into its storage module, and there was a design noncompliance. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued violations to both the utility and the supplier in that case. And whenever that happens, the regulator looks very closely at that site. The regulator, in looking closely to make, you have to bound the extent of condition and assure the corrective actions are in place. And the corrective actions are in place. The NRC has now given the green light. They tweeted that out also earlier this week. For loading operations to resume at Southern California. And part of how we got there was because the technologies that, again, now you talk about how wind and solar have changed. It's just if you bought a car 5 years ago and you just bought a car, the technology is dramatically different. Well, the same thing, if you had gone 5 years ago, the technologies to inspect canisters weren't there. Now they're not only there, they were deployed at San Onofre. The NRC became concerned, well, okay, if this canister can hang up when it's being loaded, how do we know it doesn't get scratched? And, there's a whole bunch of code arguments I won't go into there in terms of code allowable scratches or whatever you want to call them, grazes. But what really convinced the regulator here is we were able to go in there with NDE technology and look at a number of canisters that had already been loaded out at that site. Those same technologies are being deployed as part of the aging management programs that are being renewed. We're also in partnership with the Department of Energy on a number of R&D programs. We loaded a specially instrumented cast, the world's only solar-powered nuclear installation, sits at the Surrey plant out in Surrey or North Anna, I'm forgetting it, one of Dominion's sites. And the reason it's solar powered, because casks have no moving parts and contain only inert gases, is that we put a lot of monitoring on that. We're monitoring what's going on inside the casks, and the information we get is feeding the aging management programs. We're eventually going to open that cask at a DOE site. One cask was opened in 2001. We found that the fuel, after I believe 10 years of storage, was in the same condition it was in when it went in. We're going to do that again with some higher burn-up fuel. And so we really have one of the areas, the private sector, again, these three companies have been involved in this. The government is helping us on that demo project in Virginia and a couple other places. But this has really been, a function of private enterprise rising to the occasion. This is why, again, it was an unexpected solution, but it continues to be a success story. So we've got these technologies that we didn't have 5 years ago. They're there just in time. Well, we've inspected a number of sites. We're seeing the canisters continue to be in good shape, and we continue to be able to support the conclusions that NRC has made. So to me, that's the first example. The next step is in terms of reducing the burden. Remember, the goal here is to have a used fuel system that enables a competitive source of clean energy. you'll see this is what's called the spider chart or the bubble chart. Doug True, our CNO, invented this. He came to NEI from Jensen Hughes, where he was one of the pioneers of risk informing, which is actually bearing a lot of fruit on the reactor side, and now we're bringing it over to the used fuel side. What we didn't have just a few years ago, just a few decades ago, was a mature industry and any record of performance. Well, as you remember from the previous slide, we now have a strong performance record. We now have a mature, well-established industry. So we know what's safety significant and we know what's not. What we don't have is an understanding of safety margin. This is one of the things that Doug and Jensen Hughes have applied in the reactor world and is now enabling us to take a more safety-focused approach, and is enabling us to step away from unnecessary regulatory burden. We've engaged the NRC, and they've engaged back. NEI is writing a white paper that'll be out at some point this year, where we're going to talk about how much safety margin exists in these dry storage systems. And so that'll be the final piece on the left, which will enable us to do the things on the right. We can look at a graded approach to reasonable assurance, which there's already a pilot underway. TN or Arano has Amendment 16 to one of their I think it's COC 1004. And they're going to they're proposing taking a lot of stuff that's not safety significant out of the COC. One of the reasons used fuel is burdensome, even if folks like Sam's can get the government to pay for it, is you're tying up your licensing people with a lot of unnecessary NRC approvals. One of the, a lot of these details are going to come out of the of that COC, or Certificate of Compliance or license, to those not in the parlance of these general licenses. Implement performance-based inspection. I think, in aging management, we're already headed down that road in inspecting the companies that hold these licenses. I think, NRC can focus its resources, because if you're doing less licensing work, you need to rely on your inspection programs more, because you're not asking for as many pre-approvals from NRC, but everything you do should be inspectable by NRC. So the inspections need to be focused on the right stuff. The dialogue we had in the conference earlier this month, as well as in a number of public meetings, is we're doing a great job making those connections. So we are truly moving forward on that front. The last piece on the right there is dispositioning low safety significance issues, and doing it quickly. We are able to disposition low safety significance issues, but it takes months of back and forth, a lot of resources. Again, if we know where the safety margins are, and we know what challenges them and what doesn't, based on our long and strong performance record, we should have some processes in place that enable us to get more efficient. So now you can hopefully, between the way we have put in place the aging management pieces and the way we are now attacking the unnecessary burden, you can start to see that puzzle piece falling into place on the nuclear value chain that I showed you at the beginning. So I, again, am successful in moving the slides, and this is really the most exciting part. This is really the area where, when I got out of West Palm Beach, I decided that the thing NEI should broadcast is the private sector rocks. Despite everything we've accomplished, we haven't moved used fuel. And there are two interim storage initiatives. During our conference, Holtec at the Eddie Lee Alliance site announced that they got a very favorable Atomic Safety and Licensing Board review ruling from NRC. Petitions for intervention were all denied. So that site is on schedule for potential opening in 2023, licensing in 2021. The Waste Control Specialist Project, the Interim Storage Partners site at the Waste Control project at the Waste Control Specialist site, is on a similar schedule. It has not received the same ASLB ruling yet, but when you look at the petitions for intervention, they're similar enough. And unless NRC is going to become completely bipolar, you're going to get a very similar ruling there. So both of these projects are on schedule for 2023. Now you're saying, well, Congress has to do something, right? And my answer to you there, and this is what is the most exciting part of the private sector accomplishments in used fuel, is no, not necessarily. These sites are just, I cannot discuss their business models, but these sites are increasingly confident that when you look at the vertical integration that's occurring in the decommissioning sector, where the same partnerships, the same companies have incentives to more quickly decommission sites, which means they have incentives to more quickly move fuel out of the decommissioning trust fund. They still own the contract rights to the fuel. Some utilities might be interested in commercial terms to get fuel off certain sites. So when you look at the business models, and it really, again, you have to look at what's going on in decommissioning as well as used fuel, because what we're seeing is a complete vertical integration of the back end of the nuclear business. But when we get there, that's when I say, boom, that puzzle piece is down. The value chain is complete. Of course, we have to get it from here to there. And in transportation, just the other day, we had a transportation tabletop exercise to the NEI that was hosted by Entergy at the Prairie Island site. We had at least four state governments, a couple tribal governments, several federal agencies at the table, all the industry partners that are involved in moving fuel and may be involved in interim storing it. We really advanced the conversation. The level of stakeholder engagement up there at Prairie Island, there were about 150 people in attendance, and thanks to those of you who participated. We found there's a lot of questions, and we didn't answer all the questions. But I think we took the conversation in a direction where we're going to continue the dialogue here at NEI, and we're going to continue reaching out to the stakeholders so that we talk about moving used fuel all the time, and we have and do and will continue to all over the world. But these shipments are going to be different. Let's just face it. And so just because of the attention, the spotlight that's on them, and these big systems technically haven't moved yet. Most of them are smaller systems that have moved. So we're doing everything we can do to also facilitate the transportation so that when those facilities are capable of opening, with or without Congress's help, they are actually able to receive something that comes to them over the rail lines. Lastly, I will return to Yucca Mountain. This whole thing is only successful if there's an ultimate solution, and I do not want to leave anybody with the impression that NEI believes that interim storage is a solution. Interim storage is an improvement in our value chain. It is an important component of our value chain, but it really only works if there's a repository backing it up, because I think, especially in New Mexico, you've heard a lot of statements from the state politicians. They don't want to be permanent sites. They've signed up for 40 years of storage. They may, but you don't want to presuppose, sign up for another 40 years if necessary, but because you can renew these licenses for 40-year periods. But, that's not a very good going-in proposition. Now, will Congress restore Yucca Mountain? We're still rooting for it. Maybe Sam will talk more about that, maybe not. But I will tell you there are some interesting private sector initiatives on the repository side as well. There's something called deep isolation, which is basically the venture capitalist and the venture capitalist father's. The venture capitalist is the daughter of a father who's a scientist, and they're using horizontal drilling technology deployed in the gas industry to dispose of nuclear waste. They could get single-use fuel assemblies down those holes. They did demonstrate in Texas in January, and I was out there, that they could emplace and retrieve what was a simulated cesium-strontium capsule at the time. So while the private sector continues to build what Congress refuses to build on everything left of Yucca Mountain here, I'm not ruling out that the private sector will also attack this problem. Of course, at the end of the day, then, and that's when Sam comes in, is that if the private sector solves the problem, we sure want our $40 billion back. That's the balance in the nuclear waste fund, and I'm sure the lawyers will not hesitate to attack that. So back to clean energy. Again, we want to be fully competitive. Used fuel is important. managing used fuel efficiently is important to nuclear being a fully competitive source of clean energy, so we can get to that mountain lake and the whole world can look that clean. While I cannot tell you there's been any increased momentum on the federal side, I can tell you the private sector is building on past successes and is taking us forward in ways we haven't in the past. So I'll turn it back to you, Kevin, and Sam. I hope I haven't given you too tall of an order there, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rod. I'm sure we can all agree that was a very detailed and very informative presentation there. Rod, I will just take the screen back from you. And I will share my screen now. So, guys, I just wanted to say let's keep the questions coming. We've had a few questions be asked already, and I'm lining those up for the end of the Q&A at the end. But let's make sure that we're still asking questions because, like I said, even if they're not answered today, we can still submit those questions to Rod and Sam after the fact. Obviously, if there's like 2,000 questions, we won't be able to, but I'm sure there won't be. So yeah, submit those questions and we'll get Rod and Sam to answer those afterwards, and we'll send those out with the recordings as well, which would be a great little sort of value add for you listeners there. So as I'm sure you can see on my screen now, I've got some bullet points for Sam here, what Sam's going to run through. So yeah, without further ado, Sam, I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. There's always a problem with going after Rod because his slides are always more beautiful than anything I put up on the screen. But he was right. My job is to analyze and pursue on behalf of Entergy costs that we have to spend on dry fuel storage. It's kind of a fun party comment to make that my job is to sue the government. But it's not funny. It's a very serious endeavor. It's something that over the years has become a part of, business models, because without a permanent repository, you're either going to have to settle with the government or sue them to recover for costs that you're having to expend to deal with dry fuel. And part of my job in doing this on behalf of Entergy is to look for red flags, not only in things that we're doing and what the government should have done in the past, but to also look at what the government's doing moving forward and to identify issues that we may want to handle or deal with in a certain fashion. And the discrete issue I'd like to focus on today relates to the government's business model, how the government recovers costs associated with the development of either interim or permanent storage. And the first thing we need to do moving forward in analyzing that is to look where we've been. And I know I call it historical cost recovery of spent fuel storage, but have no doubts that it is the current cost recovery methodology for spent fuel storage, because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act has yet to be amended and the standard contracts are still in full force and effect. So let's take a look at a few points under the standard contract that make up the government's business model, and that's where we have to start. The first and foremost is that the government is entitled to recover through fees and interest from the industry all costs, direct, indirect, and overhead associated with their efforts. There is not a dollar that they're going to spend that is not going to be funded by all of us. And I think that's something that everybody is aware of, but it's important to note when we look at what the government is doing moving forward. Under the standard contract, there are two primary methods for recovery. One is the one-time fee, and that's for any generation on fuel prior to 1983. Many industry players have paid their one-time fees, and so that's no longer an obligation. There are some who have opted under the standard contract to defer those payments until the government comes and picks up the fuel. Entergy has at least one site that has deferred payments, and then many of our sites are young enough to where they didn't have the one-time fee obligation. Moving forward, there's the ongoing fee that everybody's familiar with. It's the 1 mil per kilowatt hour. And I know that I hope that everybody is also familiar with the fact that that fee was reduced to zero in 2014 based upon a lawsuit against the government earlier, where industry players petitioned to have it reduced to zero because we were paying for something that we weren't getting. And the court asked the Secretary of Energy, they said, well, you know what, under the statute, you're responsible for evaluating the fees collected and whether they are sufficient to cover the costs of the efforts to create a permanent repository. So go and do that and come back and tell me what you got. And when the Secretary of Energy came back, they gave a very good, well, no, it wasn't good. They gave a pitiful explanation that either the funds that had been collected were $2 trillion short of what was necessary to build a repository, or $4.9 trillion in excess. And the court says that's ridiculous. That's worthless information. And so they instructed the Secretary of Energy to make a proposal to Congress to reduce the fee to zero. Theoretically, we're still receiving bills for those fees. It's just zero. And that was done in May of 2014. Now, it's important to note those things, especially from a decommissioning perspective, because the contract says that upon the payment of all fees, you don't have any further obligations. You've done your duty. The government is responsible for coming and getting your fuel, and it's at no further cost to you. So for a shutdown plant who is no longer generating power, who has paid their one-time fee, even if the government turns back on the one-time fee, even if some point in time they come back and they say, we now have a plan, and the plan shows that we need more money, we've got to get that money. Under the current contract, decommissioning sites who've shut down shouldn't owe anything else. And so what about that gives me pause or raises red flags? Well, it has to do with what Congress is doing currently, and Rod alluded to it. Within the last few days, there was the House Appropriations Committee passed a version of the House Energy and Water Development funding bill for apportionment bill for fiscal year 2020, and it authorized $25 million spent on the development of interim storage. There are a couple of things to note here. One, we might say, well, yeah, that's great. That's good. At least the government is taking some action. At least they're moving forward and doing something. But what caught my attention is where that $25 million came from. That $25 million did not come from the Nuclear Waste Fund. That $25 million was taken from the Integrated Waste Management portion of DOE's budget. And there's a logical explanation for that. The current state of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the time for interim storage is past. If the government is going to work on interim storage, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is going to have to be amended. And there is an amendment in play. And that amendment does authorize spending for interim storage. It hasn't even been put up for vote yet, but there are efforts to have it amended to allow the government to pursue those efforts. And so you might think, oh, that's great. When that happens, well then, the efforts that the government are going to do, those billions upon billions of dollars that they've taken from us, will become the basis for what they're going to do in the future to perform their obligations under the standard contract. Well, once again, what Congress is doing has raised for me a red flag. Because, as Rod pointed out, unfortunately, there was the defeat of an amendment that called for further funding of Yucca Mountain. And it called for about $50 million to be put towards the further development and evaluation of whether Yucca Mountain was an appropriate site for the development of a permanent repository. But what caught my attention once again is the source of the funds that were recommended in the funding bill. It was defeated. It was defeated by a charge led by Nancy Pelosi saying, let's give deference to our representative in Nevada. Once again, the representative in Nevada is diametrically opposed to having a permanent repository put at Yucca Mountain, and the vote failed to pass by a short margin. But the money that was recommended for the development and payment of the further development of Yucca Mountain was going to come from what they referred to as unobligated funds that had been allocated to DOE in past years for other measures but unused. Again, it was not going to come from, or was there reference to, the Nuclear Waste Fund. And you might ask, well, why? Because that's exactly what those dollars are for. Those dollars are for the development of a permanent repository, even looking back to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act as it exists right now. That's what it's there for, as referenced by one of the congressmen in favor of the bill. That is the law of the land, that the government's supposed to do that they're supposed to provide it, and that's why they took all the money. Well, there is a appropriations rule that states that for every appropriation of what's referred to as discretionary spending, there has to be a current income stream offset for that spend. And the Nuclear Waste Fund does not qualify as a current income stream. If we think back historically, it would have made sense if the government had been performing at the time that they were taking the ongoing fees from the industry, that the ongoing fees would have qualified as a current income stream to offset the money that was being spent. But we no longer have a one-time fee, and we have many players in the industry who will no longer have to pay because they've entered decommissioning. And as we see under the standard contract as it exists, even if they turn it on, there's not a current income stream. Congressman Shimkus is making efforts to change that. Shimkus believes that there should be a credit given against the nuclear waste funds and all the money that was taken from the industry and the ratepayers under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and the standard contracts. And so if we're going to spend X number of $1 million towards the development of Yucca Mountain, which is the statutory obligation of the government, then there should be able to be a credit against the nuclear waste funds that have been collected to date. And as we all hopefully are aware, given the deficits of our government spending, that's really just a line item in a ledger. And so I'm not so sure that Shimkus's efforts are going to be successful. That's an extreme uncertainty. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with, how is the government going to pay for their efforts? And it comes back to the amendments to the Nuclear Waste Fund, which now authorizes, if it's passed, authorizes interim storage. And it does contain a provision that says this is not going to modify the standard contracts as they exist. It's not going to affect or amend. But it also says that relating to the interim storage, the Secretary of Energy can enter into new agreements. And what form are those new agreements going to take? Are they going to require additional costs? Some people may say, well, no, the government's not going to do that. But of course they will, because we look at changes that the government has made in recent years to their obligations. It's been judicially determined that the standard contract does not allow the government to take canistered fuel. So the government said, well, you know what, we're going to amend, we're going to make a new contract for new constructions that is going to contain provisions that will take canistered fuel. But these amendments also completely wipe out the company's mitigation rights. The mitigation rights are capped at $5 million, and anybody who's done anything with dry fuel knows that that's barely enough to purchase and load 2, maybe 3 casks. So what form is that going to take? And that's a question that is going to have to be answered before the government can move forward. I put in the bullet point about GTCC because it also highlights this issue that there's not a lot of certainty into how this will be paid for. GTCC, the DOE contended that GTCC isn't covered under the standard contract. Therefore, they don't have to take it. Now, of course, this was in litigation context. They were using it to oppose the recovery efforts of a company to say, you know, we've been canistering this GTCC and it's costing us a lot of money. The government should have taken it under their contract, and so we don't have to pay for it. And the court held no, GTCC is covered under the standard contract as high-level waste. But the court gave a little interesting quirk to its ruling because it said on cost recovery, we're not going to rule, but the government's not going to have to bear this cost alone. And so my question is this, and this is an issue that has impacted how we, Entergy, do our decommissioning cost studies, because we now anticipate that at some point in time there's going to be an additional cost for GTCC above and beyond the standard contract. Well, I pose to you that there shouldn't be. If GTCC falls under high-level waste under the standard contract, I go back to the way the contract is written. There are two cost recovery mechanisms under the standard contract, the one-time fee and the ongoing fee. And the ongoing fee has been reduced to zero. And under the contract, once you've paid all those fees, you have no further obligations. So for a decommissioned site who has GTCC on site and they want the government to one day take that GTCC and put it in a permanent repository along with the spent fuel, I say they shouldn't have to pay anything else. But this is an example of where the court's interpretation of the contract even, what's going to happen at that point in time. And that is another red flag that just says, you might look at it and say, well, we've paid so much money into the Nuclear Waste Fund that the government should pursue these efforts, and it really shouldn't cost us anything else. I mean, if they're right and it's $4.9 trillion in excess, then there you have it. But once again, the reality is, unless things change in Congress, they can't tap into that money because they have to have a current income stream. Are they going to turn on the 1 mil per kilowatt hour and it won't affect decommissioning sites necessarily? But if they turn it back on, is it going to overburden our existing sites and interfere with the future of nuclear fuel that Rod so eloquently said we want to have? And he's right. Are they going to create new contracts for anyone who's going to use government-sponsored interim storage where it's going to require additional payment? And then how are decommissioning sites going to cover those costs given the fact that they're not generating any income? And these are all, unfortunately, they're questions without answers right now, but they're points to think about. They're points to consider because we need to watch what Congress is doing. And we need to raise these issues and make sure that they're being addressed and not just watch legislation be put in place that may ultimately cause us a great deal more burden than the burden that we've already experienced. And as Kevin said, I'm going to be talking at the seminar in September, October. And at that point in time, we're going to go more in depth into just kind of the actions in the legislature and what we're following, as well as discuss, our perspectives on aging management and then some issues that we think exist with the whole concept of the government taking title. So I appreciate everyone listening today. I hope I've said something that's got you thinking.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. I'm sure that we will all agree that you've definitely got us all thinking. It's really interesting to hear about what the utilities have to do with regards to their relationship with the government and the fees that you're paying. And I think it's a good thing to hear because a lot of the time I think in the industry we kind of focus on the technicals or focus on the industry as a whole, and we don't tend to see the legal bits as much. So I think it's actually a great insight for the listeners today. I want to thank you both for giving your presentations. I think everyone will agree that the presentations have been very interesting and very informative. And now we are moving on to the questions and answers section. We've got a good amount of time. You guys kept very well to time, so thank you very much for that. Just want to ask all the audience, keep those questions coming. Make sure if you've got anything that you want to ask these guys, make sure that you ask them. Right now, use that questions tab, type it in, and I can deliver those questions to our presenters. So, number one. Rod, this one's to you. It says, what's the problem with utilization of used fuel?
Utilization of used fuel? The problem is quite simply is that it does reputational damage to our industry that folks don't perceive a solution. We have, as I explained, with the success of dry cask storage, and now aging management and perhaps interim storage, we've demonstrated that we can effectively manage these materials. The problem is one of perception, and it also goes to what Sam said. It's one of liability and cost because the taxpayers are paying $2.2 million a day for the consequences of Sam making a living suing the federal government. So and anybody who looks at nuclear energy and says, okay, yeah, this is the clean energy I want going forward. Do you really want to commit the taxpayers to a $2.2 million per day liability? Not that, irrespective of the fact that keeps them employed, but we've got to get past that reputational hurdle. That's really the problem. It's not a technical problem at all.
And I'd like to jump in. I mentioned at the beginning that it has become a part of our business models, and so to give a little more explanation on that, which is relevant to this question, it creates a cash flow issue that is a burden on the sites. Those expenditures that have to come out, yes, we do sue the government to get recovery, but whether you're in settlement or whether you are actually acquiring your money through lawsuits, there's a time lag. Even recovering, operational costs through rates and such, there's a time lag. And so we're constantly looking at the capital constraints that continuing to pursue dry fuel storage on a site causes. And when you look at it from a decommissioning perspective, unless something happens that removes the fuel, you're going to be paying security costs and maintenance costs, which, although greatly reduced, it's still millions of dollars a year to hold on to something that we shouldn't have to hold on to.
Okay, thanks, guys. Good stuff. Moving on, Sam, I've got a question for you. This comes from the income stream paradox that you were talking about. The fact that in order to talk about correct me if I'm wrong, but in order to talk about the permanent repository and move things forward, the government needs an income. But then the fees being paid by the utilities doesn't count as an income stream. So then they can't talk about it, but in order to talk about it, they need to have an income stream. Is that correct?
It is. Obviously they can find ways to massage the DOE budget because they took the $25 million that they wanted to spend out of appropriations for integrated waste management as a whole. There was like $47.5 million that was assigned to that piece of their budget. And Congress authorized $25 million towards the interim repository. But they all recognize that moving forward, if there is going to be any actual work in this regard, there's going to have to be additional spending authorized through the amended Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And unless they change that rule that you have to have the current income stream, you can't use the funds that were paid into the Nuclear Waste Fund over the course of years as an offset or a credit for that spending. And that's what Shimkus is trying to change. He's trying to create an exception because he says it's ridiculous that we've taken billions of dollars, and I agree, billions of dollars from the industry that we can't actually use as a credit for appropriating spending for DOE to pursue Yucca Mountain.
Yeah, I'll just add, Sam, that's why changing the arcane congressional budget rules is so important here, because there is a real income stream in that the $40 billion balance in the Nuclear Waste Fund earns interest of about $0.7 billion per year. And that's plenty of money to build a repository. That's more than enough for interim storage. It's NEI's very strongly held position that no nuclear waste fee should be imposed, no more costs should be imposed on utilities unless the expenditures of the program exceed that $1.7 billion a year and include a repository program. The federal obligation is for disposal.
Good, interesting. And so, obviously, it sounds like basically the industry is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in the fact that fees are needed to reach the conversation, but then conversation can't start without the fees being there in the first place. So, Sam, do you have any sort of recommendations there about how to move forwards, about who should be doing what? And I guess that question goes out to Ron.
Well, yeah, I would just simply say that I think I agree with Sam that Congressman Shimkus proposed the solution. What we need is very simply access to the $40 billion and the interest it earns. The electricity ratepayers of this country worked hard to earn that money, and they spent it in good faith, believing that the government would live up to its obligations.
And another, just to add on to what Rod said, we've got to change the minds. We've got to find out a way to make storage of spent fuel permanently somewhere else a sexy topic for Congress. Like I said, it was defeated by a short margin, but with a Democratic-controlled House, it's very pertinent that the ones who defeated it were Democratic players in the Democratic Party, and so they are opposed to Yucca Mountain, and they're going to fight against Yucca Mountain. And interim storage without a Yucca Mountain becomes permanent storage. And so,
well, I should point out that a number of the members of Congress who voted against that appropriations amendment the other day had voted for the Shimkus bill. And the difference is that Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada has reached a very powerful position in the Democratic Party, and then last time Senator Heller, a Republican from Nevada, was up for re-election, and they were both standing on anti-Yucca opposition. I think what I would do if you have a member of Congress who switched their vote, I'd call them up and I'd say, "What's up here?
Absolutely.
Are you for solving this problem or not?" Because it seems whichever party has the most at stake in the state that's raising what is simply a not in my backyard position seems to stop it. The Republicans stopped it in the Senate last year, and now the Democrats are stopping it in the House. So please, if you're out there, do what you can as a constituent to hold your members of Congress accountable.
I think that's a really good point, Ron. I think it's important for us to not only come at things from an industry standpoint, but again, from sort of a grassroots politics standpoint. If you can hold your members of Congress or representatives as a whole to account, especially if they're switching their votes, and I think that just helps us to sort of move the conversation forward and hold the right people to account and get these conversations happening in a more sort of objective manner. I've got another question here, and it will be addressed to Rod, I think. It will be, what is being done to address issues associated with transport of spent fuel to interim storage facilities, in brackets NEI and WCS?
Well, yeah, I mentioned the transportation tabletop exercise that Xcel Energy hosted on Tuesday. What we're doing to facilitate it on the private side is we're making sure that all the involved players are on the same page, and that was part of that. The technology to do this exists. We have systems that are licensed for transport. There's a site on the coast of California, Humboldt Bay. You only have 6 casks there. They're all licensed for transport. Jack Edlow of Edlow International will tell you he can move them if you just give him a destination, and we have 2 players trying to give him a destination. Now, all along the route, everybody needs to be prepared for these. They will receive more attention than they deserve. So that conversation is well underway. I would encourage anyone out there who's interested to become a part of that conversation. These are very public processes. The state, there are state government officials that have a very strong role here in every state. The tribes have a very strong role, and the federal agencies as well. It's just making sure that all the handoffs are smoothly organized and all the expectations are mutually clear. I think on Tuesday we did a lot to advance that, and I think we're going to continue that conversation.
And Rod, this is a question for me. Along those lines, does that include efforts to smooth over state politicians that the fuel is going to cross their lines to get where it's going?
Yes, their representatives are involved in this. I hesitate to use the term smooth over. I would put it that they need to be confident that transportation through their state will be A, safe, and B, that the costs imposed on the state will be fairly accounted for. That's why they have experts working for them. We had a lot of really great learning that the group got on Tuesday from the governor's the representative of the governor of Minnesota, who specializes in this. So the answer is we need to work with the state officials who represent those politicians and who have this expertise. And the good news, every state has such organizations and such officials. And, they're beginning to engage because these interim storage sites, as I mentioned, may very well be ready to receive by 2023. So those conversations need to happen now, and they are happening now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rod. That's really detailed, and glad that you can get involved there. Really, really good, actually. Really good to hear. In terms of looking at things sort of moving forwards, so I've got a question here that says, is there any effort to tie the used fuel to advanced reactor concepts and future energy generation? So is there any ideas around kind of recycling spent fuel that we already have sitting on its pads?
Yes, many of the advanced reactor developers will tell you that, and I believe that I believe these statements, that they have an improved used fuel stream, that they can take advantage of some of the extra energy that's in there. At the end of the day, you still have a byproduct waste that requires deep geologic disposal and, until then, long-term storage. But many of these technologies can improve the way in which, the already effective way in which we manage used fuel. And NEI is doing everything it can to advance these technologies. I continue to be amazed when we host an advanced reactor meeting, how many people show up. And I go back to the other side of the coin. It's somewhat ironic. While they may be able to better position us with used fuel with their technologies, the current situation with used fuel is sometimes a barrier to them getting the investment they need to do that.
Brilliant. Well, unfortunately, guys, I think we've had a really great webinar here, and I think the questions raised have been really interesting, and both presentations have been really interesting. But unfortunately, we are just about to run out of time, so I do have to apologise for that. Like I said, any unanswered questions that we have, we'll put those to the presenters and make sure that we can get some answers back for you guys. But yeah, I just want to say, Rod, Sam, big thanks for not only making the time to be here today, but also for providing some really valuable input to our listeners. Not only, like I said, not only have you made the time, but the presentations and the detail in the presentations and I think the answers from the questions as well have not only been sort of present, but really interesting and detailed. So I just want to say a big thank you very much to both of you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and Sam. Keep up the good work and keeping the heat on the government.
Thank you, Rod, and you keep us moving forward. Both are necessary, and thank you, Kevin, for having us.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again, guys. I'm just going to leave a little bit on the slide here for the audience. So the full audience files will be available. I'll be able to send those to you next week. You'll be notified by email as to sort of when those are going to come out. And if you want to check out what these guys are saying in a lot more detail, please do check out our website, nuclearenergyinsider.com, and just look for our nuclear decommissioning and used fuel strategy summit. We have an events page, very easy to get a hold of. But yeah, we're going to have to wrap up, guys. Thank you very much again. Do appreciate it. Thank you again, Sam and Rod, and we'll hear from you all soon.